Mind Matters Magazine's Expert Talk series, Mind the Brain. I'm Nikita Nambiar, and I had the honor of speaking with Dr. Tara Mandalaywala. Dr. Mandalaywala runs a Cognition Across Development, or CAD lab, at UMass Amherst, which explores the development of social cognition across human and non-human primates. Her research examines how young individuals make sense of and cope with the complex social world around them. They use methods from developmental and social psychology, behavioral endocrinology, and behavioral ecology to examine how the environment that an individual grows up in shapes their perception, beliefs, and biases about the world around them. The goal of this research is to better understand how early emerging aspects of cognition and perception help an individual thrive or falter in their particular environment. To know more about Dr. Mandalaywala and her research at CAD Labs, make sure to check the link in our description box below. Without further ado, let's move on to the video. Hope you guys enjoy it. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 5 of Mind the Brain, our expert talk series. I'm seated here today with Dr. Mandalaywala, Dr. Tara Mandalaywala, and I think we'll just dive straight into the questions. So to start off with, could you please explain to our viewers about the different research that you've conducted through CAD Labs?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So the CAD lab, or the Cognition Across Development lab, is the lab that I direct at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. So we're in the northeast part of the United States. And we do lots of different kinds of research. Most of the research that we do in the CAD lab currently focuses on child development. So we're really interested in understanding how young children like 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, how do they come to learn about the world around them? So how do they make sense of all the people around them in terms of their different identities? So gender identity, racial identity, religious identity, different types of groups. How do they learn that they might have a particular racial identity or gender identity? How is that shaped by the kinds of things their parents say or do? How is that shaped by the characteristics of the communities that they grow up in? And what are the long-term consequences of this? How does this shape sort of their self-esteem and their belief in what kinds of possibilities like jobs or education they could have in the future? How does it shape how they feel towards other people and what kinds of prejudice or biases they might develop? So that's a lot of what we focus on now. And then in my past life, when I was a graduate student, I worked with monkeys. So I did something very different in some respects, because obviously monkeys don't have a racial identity or a gender identity, but they are also shaped by the environments that they grow up in, and they have parents that, sort of show them the world around, and they grow up in these large social groups. And so they also have a really sort of complicated social world that they have to navigate and figure out. And we know that there are some long-term consequences for them as well, in terms of sort of navigating this social world. So that's kind of the 10,000-foot overview of what we do. We study how children of different species sort of grow up and how all these different factors in their early life environments shape the individuals that they go on to be, and sort of how well they do in the world around them.
That's super cool. And you touched upon something right now in your answer, which was inequality. And that's something that we notice everywhere, right? Especially now. So be it due to color, religion, gender, caste. So from the research that you've conducted, have you noticed any pattern to this? Like, what do you think leads people to think of someone as not being equal to them?
That's such a great question. And I would say it's actually even trickier than that in sort of figuring out what are the factors that contribute to this, because some research that I've done that just was published recently actually shows that really young children, so children as young as like 3.5 years old, right? So they're barely stringing together like full coherent sentences. And yet even these really young kids sort of are aware of stereotypes about social status and about inequality. So they expect that white people will live in nicer houses than Black people, and that boys will be sort of more socially dominant and be more able to make decisions and be allowed to make decisions more so than girls. But we don't find that this actually seems to shape how they feel about white people or Black people or boys and girls. So we still observe that girls, like girl participants, like girls better, even if they think that girls are sort of socially subordinate and lower status than boys. So it seems like there's like a couple different pieces. So kids first have to sort of become aware of inequality in the world around them. And we don't know how they do that yet. That's some ongoing research we have in the lab now, where we know that it develops early, but what is the actual input that kids are getting? Is it enough just to sort of passively observe the world around you and notice that, well, most of the time when I look at my school principal is a man, but my teachers are women, and my teachers sort of report to the school principal. So does that sort of lay the foundation for these stereotypes? Do they look when they're driving into different communities with their parents and see that, oh, well, when I see white people, they tend to live in these bigger houses, and maybe when I see black people, they tend to live in apartments. So is that laying the foundation? And how much of it is coming from places like the media and the kinds of portrayals that they see in their cartoons or the television shows that they're like sneakily watching while their parents are actually watching them? So we know very little about exactly where these ideas and stereotypes come from, and then how they turn into biases or prejudices towards lower status groups. But as you sort of alluded to, we have inequality in so many different dimensions across the world. So in India, right, there's this caste system, which is really prevalent, which is not something that we have played out quite in the same way in the US. So one thing that we're really interested in doing in my lab is trying to do cross-cultural research to understand what are the similarities and differences and how kids acquire these ideas about inequality and social status from country to country, and how might the inputs, some things maybe be the same, some things be different, etc.
Yeah, that's amazing. And yeah, inequality is a big issue. So it's really great that you're seeing what kind of drives that from a young age. Now, I'm going to steer in a little bit of a different direction, actually, to social cognition across non-human primates. So that is really interesting. And I know our last expert talk series, the professor actually worked with fish. So here you're working with rhesus macaque monkeys. So I was wondering if you could share like a few anecdotes with the work that you did with them, and like something interesting maybe that happened while you were working with them. Maybe an idea that you had of monkeys beforehand that kind of got disrupted. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's been a while since I've worked with them. So I worked with the rhesus macaques down in Puerto Rico, actually. So I had a really hard life in grad school. I had to go and move to Puerto Rico and live on a beach and take a boat out every morning to go to my field site, where I would follow a bunch of baby monkeys around and record everything that they did. And then I did some cognitive tests on them also. And you're right in some ways, like humans and non-humans are clearly, my cat is trying to join in on our phone call. Humans and non-humans are different in lots of really important and meaningful ways. But they're also really similar in a lot of ways as well, which is how I got interested in studying them. So especially when we think about inequality and social status, that's actually one place where there's a lot of overlap, because the rhesus macaque monkeys that I worked with also exist in these really sort of structured dominance hierarchies. So there's like an alpha male and an alpha female, and like in your social status is sort of inherited along the females at least. In males, it's a little different. But so one of the things that we could do was sort of study what are the consequences of a baby monkey that's growing up in a like low position in a dominance hierarchy versus in a high position in a dominance hierarchy, and how does the kind of information that they learn about the world around them differ. And I think one of the coolest, one of my favorite studies that I did when I was down there was actually, I followed these monkeys when they were really young, when they were like from birth to about 9 months of age. And I collected a lot of behavioral data on them, and I figured out sort of where they were in this social rank. And then I also did some cognitive tests where I showed them pictures of the same monkey making two different facial expressions. And you guys have rhesus macaques in India, so you might be familiar with these. One was just sort of a neutral face, like no emotional expression. And the other was what we call sort of like a threat face, where they open their mouth really big and they show you their teeth. And like, this is a thing that means like, hey, leave me alone, right? Like, I do not want to play right now. So we showed the baby monkeys these two images at the same time. And what we were curious was whether they looked longer at this aggressive sort of threatening stimulus or whether they looked longer at the more neutral phase stimulus, or whether they didn't differ, like they didn't discriminate. And what we found was that at 3 months of age, these baby monkeys looked equal amounts of time at both of them. So they didn't seem to be paying more attention to the threatening stimulus. But by 9 months of age, we found that they looked significantly longer at that threatening phase. And this makes sense, right? Like you should be paying attention to threatening things in your environment so you don't get eaten by like an adult monkey or like beat up or pushed out of a tree or whatever. So that was really cool. And we found that actually it was the babies of the higher ranking moms that looked longer at the threatening stimulus, which was totally contrary to what we had expected. We thought it'd be the low ranking monkeys, right, that would need to pay more attention to these threatening, but it was actually the high ranking that were paying more attention. And we think this might have been because for these high ranking monkeys, they weren't used to this threatening phase. Like their mom wasn't getting threatened all the time, and that's who they spent most of their time with. So they were like, oh, wait, what is this? Maybe I need to pay attention to it. So I thought that was really cool. And it was just so interesting to see like this clear connection between these environments and these sort of experiences that these baby monkeys had had, and then what they actually paid attention to later on. And if we have time, I can tell you, we did a follow-up when these babies were like 3 years old to look and see if the ones that paid more attention to the threatening stimulus actually got like less stressed out later on. But we can talk about other things. I can always come back to that.
Sure. And actually, talking about a threat, I kind of take COVID-19 as being a threat, especially now. India's cases are like rising exponentially, and I think it's similar in the US as well. So if we look at this current situation that we're in, a lot of people like are reacting differently to the very same thing, right? Some people are able to cope well with it, others aren't. So like they're not able to cope as well with it. So I wanted to know, well, some people are able to like work on their physical health and improve aspects of themselves during this time, while others fall into like a depressive state. Do early aspects of cognition and perception actually play a role in this?
I think that's a really good question. And this is a little bit outside my area of expertise. So this will be just me thinking through this a bit. I mean, we know that there are things that happen early in life that can predispose people to be more likely to develop depression or anxiety, things like that later on. I don't know if you guys have ever talked in sort of this online program on about the stress diathesis model, which is something that I think about a lot in my research. So the general idea with stress diathesis is that people have biological or genetic predispositions that might make them more likely to develop depression or anxiety or other sort of mental health issues. But unless they're put in particular types of environments, those things are less likely to manifest. So if you're predisposed to depression, but you grow up in a super warm and loving household and you go through college and you get a job easily and like you're never really in a situation that taxes you or stresses you out, then you might never develop it. In contrast, you could be someone who is less likely to develop depression, but if you're in a really rough situation from early in life and that sort of continues on, then you might be more likely to develop. So in terms of COVID-19, I think it's going to be a really interesting sort of situation to look at the long-term effects of, because you could imagine that we're actually creating a generation of kids who are super resilient, who have been like, I had to deal with a lot when I was younger, and now I've developed coping strategies and ways of building routine and structure into really unstructured times, or, spending less time on the computer because my mom won't let me all the time, and like reading more. So there could be lots of benefits that come out of this. There could also be the fact that parents are trying to work while their kids are at home. And so they're like just shoving their kids in front of a TV or a computer, and they're trying to let them self-direct in their education. And it's not something that kids are really well equipped to do. So I think it's going to be really important once we make it to the other side of this pandemic to really ask questions that take advantage of this sort of natural experiment that we're in, and try and understand what the long-term consequences are.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And hopefully the end is coming near.
Fingers crossed.
So there's one question that I love to ask all the experts that come on for the Mind the Brain series, and that's, what is one new development that's taken place in the cognitive sciences that you find really interesting?
Oh, that's good. I'm going to cheat a little bit and say two things. So one is that I think we have a greater appreciation nowadays, and in the past maybe 10 or 15 years, for just how sophisticated young children's thinking is. So, there's often been this, like, from the 50s and 60s, like this old trope of like children are just kind of dumb. And like they really aren't thinking, they don't have these higher generalized abstract concepts in their head that are shaping the way they see the world. They're just sort of taking in information and slowly putting it together. And I think we know now that kids are actually remarkably intelligent and are really good at extracting patterns and information from the world around them. So I think that this acknowledgement and that maybe kids are doing more than we think is allowing us to ask questions that are more sophisticated of younger kids. And we just have to be, especially in developmental science and when working with non-humans, really creative about how we ask those questions to make sure that we're tapping into what we think we are and that it's appropriate for that age group. So they might have these really cool thoughts going on in their head, but it's not like they can read or they can't keep track of a lot of different pieces of information at the same time. So you have to come up with sort of these workarounds to tap into it. So that's one. The other is that I think that there's been this push to do more cross-cultural research and research that has a greater sort of diversity of participants. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time because I rely on kids coming from lots of different backgrounds, having lots of different types of experience to be able to understand how variation in experience affects the development of social cognition and these long-term outcomes. But I think it's something that more people are getting excited about. And so there's just lots of cool stuff that's coming out that's treating diversity both in terms of like just within the US, right? We have kids who have lots of different family structures and live in lots of different types of communities. And so we're actually taking advantage of that. And then doing research across countries. So we talked about with the social status, like one dream project I have is to go to places that have all of these different types of social status and also that encode social status in their language in different ways. So some languages have like a formal tense. So Spanish has like a formal and an informal. To me, I'm like, that seems like kids would be picking up very different things if they're growing up in a language that has this linguistic encoding of status versus growing up in a language like English, which doesn't have it linguistically encoded in the same way. So those are two things that I'm really excited about right now.
And yeah, that's definitely super cool. And definitely areas of research that we haven't spoken about in this talk series. So thank you for bringing it up. And I'm sure our audience would love to like read up more about it. Now I'm going to go maybe into a little bit more personal question, but it's more about how did you realize that cognition and behavior was your calling? Like, was there something specific that kind of attracted you towards this field?
I actually tried avoiding it very, very much when I was in college. So both my parents actually had a company in which they designed like little mice and rat treadmills for animal behavior researchers who were doing sort of pharmacological research. And so I grew up in that world and I was like, I'm never going to study animal behavior. Absolutely not. I want nothing to do with it. And then I went to college and I was going to study genetics. I always knew I wanted to do science, but I thought I wanted to be a geneticist. And I went to college and I bombed my genetics class. Like just, it was terrible. And I was like, maybe I don't. And I would actually tell my like 18-year-old self now that I probably should have tried again. And I shouldn't have taken like that one failure as like, I can't do this. And like, I use genetics now, so I couldn't escape it. But at that time, I was like, let me just explore and see what else. And I just stumbled into this class that was biological anthropology. It was the introductory class. I'd never heard of it before. And it was all about human evolution and understanding like behavioral ecology and animal behavior. And it was just cool. And I stumbled into a research lab that was working with lemurs, which are a type of non-human primate that are typically found in Madagascar. But we had a bunch at my college. And so I started studying them and I just loved it. Like I loved the kinds of questions. I love thinking about evolution. I think that's really like where I come from. This idea of adaptation to me is kind of amazing. and that we are these creatures that have so many range of possibilities in the ways that we can develop, and we develop in these really sensible ways that fit our environments most of the time, not always. So that it just all kind of clicked. And the lovely thing I think about science is that you don't have to fully commit to one area and stick with that for the rest of your life. So even though I did my PhD in studying monkeys, I knew after and sort of halfway through my PhD, I was like, I'm really interested in humans as well. I'd like to get experience. So I did a postdoctoral fellowship, which you often do after you finish your PhD, to get training in some other area. And so I did that in a human developmental psychology lab. And I was like, oh, I really like working with humans. Actually, this is very cool. And so now I mainly work with humans, but I have every intention of going back and working with the monkeys and doing some more of this comparative work that sort of got me into the field when I started.
Yeah, that's, again, super great and super relevant, especially for like students like me who are going to be deciding college majors, and students who are going into college, and like basically our viewer base. And so for the viewer base also, like I am someone who loves research, and I don't know there are a lot of kids out there who also like research. So I just wanted your thoughts on how we can kind of expose ourselves to research once we're in college, or like even during this time, and any advice that you have for us, basically.
It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I think that when you're in college, and of course with COVID, like things are exceptional and circumstances are strange, but one day it will go back to how it was. So when you're in person, I think the best way to find out if you like research and what kind of research you like is to do it, right? It's so hard to know without, and there are so many great things about research. Like you get to come up with questions and like that no one knows the answer to, and you get to try and figure out a way of answering it. Like that's amazing. But there's also a lot of it that is like boring and tedious. So there's a lot of data entry, and there's a lot of just like going through and like, you're like, I know there's a mistake in here somewhere. Like, where is it? I spend hours of my life doing that. And you need specialized skills, right? You need to be able to do statistical analysis. So there's a lot of pieces to it. You don't have to acquire those all in one go, right? Like ideally you join a lab and you get to see people that are doing pieces of that and sort of jump in and get involved, and then build up your skill set. So I think that's number one. As soon as you can get involved in research, do it. Because you might also find, I have some people that join my lab and they're there for a year and they're like, I don't really like doing research. I'm like, that is a very important thing to know. Like, at least you ruled out that this is a thing you want to do. The other thing is just reading papers. I think this is great also when you're trying to figure out if there's a particular lab that you might want to join at wherever you're going to college. So looking up the faculty that are in the department that you might be a major in, or even other departments. My research was always in psychology, even though I was a biological anthropology major. And reading the papers of the people that are there and seeing what kinds of things jump out at you and that you're interested in. Reading papers is a skill to learn as well that will serve you well. So that's useful. And talking to people. I think what you're doing with this sort of expert series and interviewing is great. I always get excited when I talk to someone who's really excited about their research, because it sort of reinvigorates me, and I'm like, oh yeah, this is actually a really fun process. There's a lot of work involved, but it's great.
So kind of as a concluding thought, are there any myths that you've come across during your time doing research that you'd like to break, and kind of tell us maybe why those myths formed, and how we can move past them? Like,
Yeah.
I know a big myth that I brought it up in the last Expert Talk series too, was like that we only use 10% of our brain, which is completely false.
Yeah. Completely false. Oh my goodness, any myths? I guess one myth that I think about a lot is thinking about like evolution and natural selection, and this idea that evolution is a linear process, I think is something that sorry, my cat is crawling all over me, that we see a lot, and that is often depicted even in the way, so if you look at sort of like an evolutionary diagram, you'll often see humans are like at the end, and then like there's like this linear thing where like all the other species are behind us, and that's not the way evolution works at all. Evolution makes lots of mistakes, and there's lots of little branches that never actually go anywhere, or we don't have a record of them. And adaptations and like sort of this process by which new species develop or species become sort of particularly well suited to their environment, that's also a completely random process, right? It relies on random mutations that happen that introduce variation into a population. And so the adaptations that we see might not always make the most sense and might not always fit exactly that environment, because it's not like evolution is coming up with this perfect solution. It's just figuring out what works and then having more of that in the next generation. So I think, I mean, this is important to me, but I think anyone who is really interested in doing research in any sort of biological, psychological, neuroscience, any of those fields, should make sure they have a really firm grasp on what evolution is and how natural selection works. And that's just a really solid foundation.
So that brings us to the end, actually, of the talk today. Thank you so much for coming. This was super fun. It was amazing talking to you, and I know our audience would love this. So
I'm so glad. Thanks for having me.
thank you so much for coming.